Ta-da.
Okay, good morning, freshmen. Last week, you might remember that you asked questions about being Jewish, Judaism, and about the Holocaust. And as promised, I'm getting those questions answered for you. I'd like you to meet Ellie Gettinger, and she is the educator at the Jewish Museum of Milwaukee, where we would possibly have gone for a field trip this year, but we've gone virtual, so we've gone virtual. She is not coming to us live from the Jewish Museum, unless there's like some strange bedroom scene there that I'm not familiar with.
This is Gold in My Ears bedroom. It's very authentic.
And she lived in Florida. So she's actually visiting Florida, got away from our lousy Milwaukee weather for a few days. So I'm going to take the questions that you guys asked, and Ellie's going to answer them.
I am really excited. I was so impressed by the questions, by the thoughtfulness about them, and also just by the way in which you both had clearly taken in some of the aspects of the tour of the exhibit, and then also just kind of big questions you've had as you've been studying the Holocaust and night. So I'm excited to work through them.
Okay, so Ellie, the first question, and I really like this question because it's something that I hear adults often confused by. So the question is a Jew labeled as Jewish because of religion or because of lineage?
This is an incredibly complicated question. And there were a couple of questions in this same universe about what makes you Jewish. Is it your descendant? Is it your ancestry? Or is it a personal feeling? And I'd like to go with the sense of both. And that how this is an incredibly complicated question if you're outside of the Jewish faith, and it's an incredibly complicated question inside the Jewish faith.
Mm-hmm.
So let's start by breaking down what it means to be Jewish. And someone else had picked on this point of the matrilineal descent. Traditionally, Judaism was passed down from the mother to child. And I think if you think historically, thousands of years ago, before DNA tests, it's very easy to tell who someone's mother is after they're born. Not so easy always to tell who a father is. So this is a way of saying we know exactly who your mother is. We know that that person was Jewish, so therefore you are Jewish. Now, let's fast forward thousands of years later, and there's all sorts of differences in the way families and structures and things work. And in the 1980s, the Reform Jewish community, which is kind of the most liberal, the most the most open to taking on new ideas in Jewish practice, decided that you could be Jewish if your mother was Jewish or if your father was Jewish, which was a big change in terms of a statement by an organized part of the Jewish community saying everybody could, if you had this feeling of being Jewish, you were Jewish. And it also threw some things into kind of flux. There's a big transition here where there's some people who are Jewish according to the Reform movement, who might not be considered Jewish according to the Orthodox or conservative movements, other parts of the Jewish community. So with that said, I will say that within the Jewish community, we're constantly in this question of who counts as a Jew. There are all sorts of debates about this. And I think for us in the purposes of the Jewish Museum, that generally we go, if you feel Jewish, then you are Jewish. But that kind of legal, there are people within the Jewish community who would say, no, you're Jewish if your parent is Jewish. When we look at the context of the Holocaust, it gets a little more complicated than that too. Because according to Hitler's definition, you were Jewish if one of your 4 grandparents was Jewish. It didn't matter if it was your mother's mother or your father's father. And in that case, that means that there are people who might be very far removed from a Jewish identity that were still considered Jewish. Now, again, within the idea of Israel, which says we have a law of return where if you are Jewish, you can come back, they hold to that definition. Because the sense is, if you were Jewish enough to be traumatized, to be killed by Hitler, then you should be Jewish enough to be able to come to Israel. So that's a long answer to a straightforward question that has no simple answer.
Definitely. So sort of piggybacking off of this question, why is conversion to Judaism so difficult?
It's a tough question. I think that the sense is from the rabbis that they wanted people to have a really serious sense of purpose, that being a Jew is complicated and hard, and there are all sorts of laws and commandments that we're supposed to take on, and it shouldn't be the sort of thing that you take on without having that kind of same sort of seriousness of intent. So the nature of conversion traditionally in Judaism is that you're supposed to ask 3 times before you could be converted. You're supposed to come to the rabbi 3 times and say, this is why this is important to me. If any of you, and this might be a little inappropriate, but there's an excellent scene from Orange is the New Black where one of the characters is trying to convert to Judaism, and she explains this to a rabbi 3 times. And it's one of the best things I've ever seen. But just that one scene, the rest of Orange is the New Black, you guys can decide, your parents can decide. But it is an amazing thing that there is this kind of seriousness of intent. You have to show that why you want to be Jewish. You need to demonstrate this. And because I think there's this sense that this isn't a religion that, you can just say, well, I'm taking on this, this, and this. You're supposed to come in with this kind of purposeful intent on how you want to practice.
Excellent. Thank you. The next question that somebody had was, what are some common misconceptions about Jews and Judaism?
I think one of the hardest things, and this is one of the things when you're studying the Holocaust that becomes one of the challenges as well, because one of the things in looking at kind of Nazi propaganda that they used so often were stereotypes and things like that. And then those stereotypes, even as you're studying them, become kind of built into an understanding of what Jews are or who Jews are. Some of the most common, I think, are Jews control the media, Jews control banking and finance. Mm-hmm. And to some extent, there are a lot of Jews involved in both the media, banking and finance, government, those sorts of things. But we don't control any of those institutions. That is certainly, and that's a very dangerous stereotype, because that's right. A stereotype that then builds into bigger anti-Semitic tropes as well, that becomes the basis for why Jews need to be taken down or killed. Oh, because they control these things and we don't see their kind of power structures. So that's one that I always like to debunk. I think there's also kind of from a more universal standpoint, there's a sense that Jews look like Lori and me, like Miss Zelinsky and me.
I'm Lori.
You're Lori? Okay.
Yeah.
The Jews are all dark haired and white, and they're Eastern European, and there is amazing diversity among Jews. Mm-hmm. Jews can be Black, they can be Latino, they can be Asian. You don't have Jews, being Jewish is not this like monolithic, it's not a race. And so I think it's a really hard thing, especially when you're studying the Holocaust, that so much of that is based within Eastern Europe, that to understand that there is diversity of Jewish cultures, beliefs, and practices, and that we're not all one and the same. There is no like, this is what Jews are, this is who they are. Those are kind of the 2 big ones that jump out at me right now. Are there any other that really you think of a lot, Lori?
None that I can think of. I know this is a really frightening example, but when I went to college, which was a while ago, I met some kids from a small town in Wisconsin who had never met anybody Jewish before and asked me where my horns were, because
they saw that I pointed immediately to my head. This is
and these were kids in college, so right. Presumably somewhat educated, who believed this myth about Jews.
That is a strange and long-standing one. And it's one of those ones that it's like, it goes back, there are a couple of big sources for this. One is the sense that Jews, and this was a myth that was perpetrated by the church, both the Catholic and the Lutheran church, that Jews were in league with the devil. So of course we would have horns like the devil would have horns. The other place where this myth was commonly resubscribed, or people saw as a proof text, is Michelangelo did a statue of Moses. And in the Torah, when it talks about Moses, they talk about him being illuminated by these 2 pillars of light. Mm-hmm. Now, the word in Hebrew for these pillars also is very close. And remember, when you're reading from the Torah, you're reading it in Hebrew and you're reading it without vowels. So that word is very close to the word Karen, which means horns as well. So it's often mistranslated as if you're someone who doesn't really understand the context, as Moses had horns, and so Michelangelo, seeing this, created a Moses with horns, and that's yet another place.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I'd never heard that before. Okay, last question, and this is actually a question that I think about a lot as well. So whatever student wrote this, really good thinking. What do you think Jewish life will look like 100 years from now?
Oh gosh. You know what? I couldn't have told you what Jewish life would look like 6 weeks ago today, just how much transition has happened. One of the biggest things that I think we have seen in the last 2 months is the fact that Passover happened in this time period.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and a lot of you guys had questions about holidays. Passover is actually the most observed Jewish holiday in the world. And one of the reasons why it's so observed is because this is a holiday that commemorates the going out of Egypt, the Exodus, and it's a holiday in which most of the practice takes place at home. You have a Seder, this big meal with your family. You're going through some sort of exploration of what that means to go from slavery to freedom, and then you eat some food. And people do it in all sorts of different ways, but about 70% of Jews have some sort of Passover observance, which is much higher than holidays like Hanukkah, which is surprising because that's generally the holiday that people know, or like our most holy, significant holidays, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, are high holidays. So generally, this is done around a table, but we now have this conflict of how do we observe Judaism if we can't all be at the same table? If I'm in Milwaukee and my parents are in Tennessee and my sister's in Florida, how do we make that happen? And it was interesting because generally there are parts of the Jewish community that are very opposed to using electricity. This is,
Right.
built in to their practice. You don't use any cell phones, any computers, any devices on holidays. You take a break from all of those things. And because the rabbis were so concerned about the health of the communities, they said it is more important to be healthy and to stay home and to use technology than to obey that other commandment. The sanctity of life was really the thing that came up. So I think for me, this is that was an amazing transition because these are rabbis who often aren't thinking, how do I want to live in the modern world? But in this case, they did. What I think we're going to see in the Jewish community in 100 years is increasing diversity, more and more and this is where I hope that I'm wrong about this. I think there might be more polarization between kind of more Orthodox community, the people who are really set in their religious practice, and the more liberal side. And there might be a bigger divide between those two pieces where there's less communication. In the same way that in the United States, you sometimes see increasing separation between people on the left politically and people on the right. And I think there's going to be this question of how do these two sides of the community relate to each other? Because I think that's going to be hard. And I'm worried about that. That's one of those things that I feel like we're better as a community on both politically in America and religiously in Judaism when we can have conversations across those differences. And I want to figure out in 100 years that we're actually having those conversations, and it's not just here are the people who practice Judaism very strictly, and here are the people who have a more liberal observance.
Right. Okay, let's switch to the questions that my students posed about the Holocaust. Students, Ellie was nice enough to take the questions that I posed for her and kind of put them in a logical sequence. So unfortunately, we're of course not going to get to every question, but I tried to pick ones that would, first of all, give you a really strong picture of the Holocaust and support what you've been reading and what you're learning in world history. And also, I lost my train of thought. I don't know what the second reason was, sorry. So Ellie, the first question is, how was Hitler able to rise to power and become a dictator?
I feel like this is going to sound kind of like, you're going to be like, well, that sounds very familiar. Hitler was able to come to power because he was coming from a very post-World War I Germany had a really challenging economy. They had been kind of embarrassed in the global scene, and they'd been forced to pay these kind of very high reparations. And then there is kind of a political vacuum that's left there. And there are a bunch of different factions that are fighting for who's going to take control of Germany in that post-World War I environment. This is after 1918. And so you have all these people at play, and Hitler and the Nazi Hitler and the Nazi Party started getting groups together around a vision of a better Germany, a vision of a Germany that wasn't embarrassed in a war, a vision of a Germany that was militarily strong and their economy was growing again. And then on the other side of that, they started also using kind of anti-Semitic tropes and anti-immigrant tropes and all sorts of things that existed already. When I say tropes, I mean things that were already part of a kind of a culture. Mm-hmm. So it might be the sort of thing where there were long-standing superstitions about Jews from the Lutheran Church that then they pulled in, and they took those kinds of long-standing superstitions and they married that to newer racialized anti-racism. So this is the sort of thing where they would have kind of a pseudoscience that would say, well, this is the hierarchy of race, and we, the Aryans, are at the top, and the Jews are at the bottom. And they would have all of this science about why that was so. So they would take both sides of this, and then they would say, basically, Jews are to blame for all of the problems that we have in Germany. They're the reason we were in that war. They're, making up these kinds of stories. One of the things that Hitler's propaganda minister said is that you tell a big lie and you tell it enough and people will believe it. And I think that really you see that at play in Nazi Germany. Now, one of the things that also plays into Hitler's rise to power is that he is never actually elected by a majority of the German citizens. It's about 30% of Germany that votes for Hitler, which is still an incredibly high number to vote for a racist platform. Mm-hmm. But there's this sense that if Hitler is, in power, that he'll be the chancellor and he'll be the president and there'll be a chancellor, and the two will have to share this power, and he's going to, people say things when they're running for office, but no one will govern that way. There was a real sense that he could be controlled, and that was definitely not true. Mm-hmm. Within months, the Nazi Party had taken over all parts of the German government. So I think you have to see both sides of that and how propaganda can be utilized to mobilize and things like that. And one of the things that Hitler does as he is taking over is he kind of removes Jews from the public sphere. Jews can't be in the same parks. They can't be in the same school. They can't be in certain jobs. So, sounds scary. Your dog does not like these laws, and neither do I.
3 dogs here.
So that's I think one of the ways in which Hitler takes power, and I think it's always the thing we need to be aware of when we see people using fear-based propaganda and kind of these big racial tropes. To what end are they doing that, and how are people being mobilized by that?
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to try to combine the next few questions. All right, so there's
I'll try to be shorter too, I'm sorry.
It's okay. So how did Jews outside of Germany feel hearing what was happening? And I'm going to add to that, even though America didn't know the full extent of the Holocaust, why wasn't it still alarming or concerning to the government that something was happening to the Jewish community? So I don't know.
I thought both of these questions were so good, and I'm so excited that you guys thought of this. The Jewish community actually had a sense of what was going on. Like, the extent of what was going on wasn't as broadly, like by the time you get to Auschwitz and the final solution, that is not revealed. But the fact that Hitler is marginalizing Jews in Germany, the fact that Jews are being targeted, the fact that Jews have been limited from the economy, and even things like Kristallnacht, when Jewish businesses are being destroyed, that is well known. One of my favorite pieces to show people in the museum is a blow up of the Wisconsin Jewish Chronicle. Now, this is a Jewish newspaper that's been published since the 1920s in Wisconsin. Does not have like a super large reporting arm that's out there, you know, getting facts on the ground. But the newspaper is from September 29th, 1939. So this is a month after the beginning of World War II. Begins on September 1st when Poland is invaded. And the headline says, Jews in Poland targeted, thousands killed. And this is a month after the invasion of Poland. There's already a sense in Milwaukee and at the Wisconsin Jewish press that thousands of Jews are being killed. Which means that, you know, people know. And if the Wisconsin Jewish Chronicle knows, then definitely the US government knows, and the New York Times know, and all of these things. The Jewish community was really conflicted on how to respond. Jews in America at that time were in this kind of tenuous place where they felt safe and secure, but they also were nervous about rising anti-Semitism in America. Right. There were people on the radio like Father Coughlin who had massive popularity. There were people like Charles Lindbergh, an American hero. He had been this great aviator who were out there with anti-Semitic messages. And there's this real concern that if they push too hard to say America needs to enter this war, America needs to do something, that American Jews would be impacted as well. Right. So there's this difficult position in that way. And there were many Jews who were saying we need to do a lot. And there were some who were like, well, I don't know what we do. And then on the flip side, the government was kind of indifferent to it, even when they did know things. I think the most famous account of this is the SS St. Louis. And I'm not sure if your students are familiar with this story, but there was a ship that came from Germany with about 900 people. And they were on the ship. They initially thought they had visas to get into Cuba, but their visas ended up being voided. And they're sitting outside of Miami. Like literally you can see the city of Miami from the boat. And the US has the option of thinking, should we take these people in or should we turn them away? Right. And they turn them away. And 2/3 of the people on that boat end up in countries that are later occupied by the Nazis. So many of the people on that boat actually end up being killed by the Nazis.
Right. The boat didn't go to New York or anything like that. It was sent back to Europe. So
yeah. And literally the only reason why any of the people were rescued on the boat at all was because the captain was really smart and started calling countries and saying, oh, England, will you take this many? France, will you? And, you know, oh, England's taking this. So it made it a competition. But that's the only reason those people got anywhere. So I think that there was some institutional anti-Semitism in the United States. And there was also this sense of, we're in the middle of a Great Depression here. We can't take this on. So I think there's a lot of big questions that come up. You know, why did they bomb the train tracks to Auschwitz? They knew they did know at some point what was going on there, and they could have limited it, and they didn't. So it's certainly one of those kind of damning moments in American history. On the flip side, if the US hadn't entered the war, probably things wouldn't have turned out better. So there's that kind of challenge to consider as well when you're kind of looking at history and how it's being judged.
Right. Okay. So my students have been able to see quite a few artifacts from the Holocaust. They watched a video where Oprah and Ellie visited Auschwitz, so they got to see some of that. They saw the artifacts from the Jewish Museum in Milwaukee. So somebody asked, how did those pictures come to be? How were the pictures acquired? Who took the photos?
That is one of I think it's fascinating. I think it's an act of resistance that we have those pictures, that they're preserved, and that they were taken at all. So the ones in our exhibit are showing the Lodz ghetto, which there were a number of people who were assigned all sorts of different projects within the ghetto. You know, this was like a factory town. Everyone had a job. If you weren't working, you were probably going to be killed or deported. You know, so one of the people who were photographers before the war, that was seen as a very valuable job. And actually last year we had an exhibit similarly with a photographer And her pictures also become this kind of moment of survival and a moment of resistance, just taking the pictures. So these people were given these cameras to take pictures to show how productive the ghetto was. Two of these Jewish gentlemen. But what they end up doing, they do take their pictures that they need to, but they also start taking photos that document what's going on, so people have a visual record. And they start taking photos of people living in the ghetto, so you see people as humans as opposed to just cogs in a machine. So the Nazis are basically giving them, and the two photographers that I'm thinking of here are a guy named Henrik Ross and Mendel Grossman, the means of their resistance, but then they have to find the opportunity to take those photos. I think both of them created holes in their jackets so that they could have a camera hidden within their jacket and they could take a picture while no one was looking. Henrik Ross, one of those two photographers, as he was about to be deported, he took a bunch of his pictures and buried them. And those are the photos, if you look through the video tour, and I can send Lori some pictures, some of these other pictures, they look damaged. You see things, maybe you have half a picture, or you just see the surround. There's things that are out, and they're damaged because they were buried underground, and there was dirt and water and all of the things that shouldn't touch a negative. And so he came back, he survived the war, he was in Auschwitz, he was transferred to other camps. And he comes back after the war and he takes back his pictures.
Wow.
So that's how he got those pictures. I think one of the things, and especially as we get further and further away from the Holocaust, from survivors being able to share their particular stories, that having objects like this, being able to see that and hear the story and understand of how hard it was for this object, an object like Rivka's diary too, to get to us, that it took someone finding it, that it took someone saving it, that it took someone translating it, and it might have taken decades for that to happen, is an important part of telling the story as well.
Mm-hmm. Excellent, thank you. That's super interesting. So this is a really interesting question. My students, one of the assignments while we've been learning virtually is I had them get on the HERC website, and they watched the interviews with the survivors. Yeah. So, and in previous years, last year, when we came to the museum, we heard Nancy Barnett's story, and the year before that, Arlene Peltz came and shared her husband's amazing story with my students. So I've tried to give them a number of different survivor stories, but one of my students asked if there have been any Germans or Nazi party members who have shared their side of the story, and how they felt.
You don't see a lot of that in the immediate. What you do see is a lot of children of those people coming forward and trying to figure out why their parents, grandparents did what they did. Mm-hmm. So a lot of grappling in that, like, you have this complicated legacy and you want to know why. What you do see in the kind of immediate aftermath of the war are their war crimes tribunals. And so there is that testimony that exists at Nuremberg. You have the Eichmann trials in the 1960s, and there continue to be Nazi trials that happen when you get that kind of, and it's legal, and it's not in the same, moral reckoning that I think your student probably is looking for in this moment. But you do get that, and you do get people, I think, more on the flip side, who were kind of lower level Nazis grappling with this a lot. But I'm not sure that there's a huge public grappling with it, if that makes sense. What I do think is interesting to note is in Germany, there are incredibly strict laws against anti-Semitism and propaganda and things like that, because they feel, and there's also an incredibly robust education for understanding the Holocaust. Mm-hmm. In a way that I don't think in America we have this incredibly strong curriculum on understanding what happened to Native Americans and being able to explore that story. There is really a kind of truth and reconciliation piece that is a part of the public consciousness in Germany. Sometimes there's some backlash that they feel like it's too much. But it is a more public process than you see in, say, America, in which we're grappling with the challenges of slavery, or we're grappling with issues around Native Americans, or those sorts of things.
And then another question that a student asked, and I'd like to sort of give a personal example of this, was, do Jews still look at German people with hatred? And I can speak from my own. My parents and my grandparents were all born in the United States, but my mother in particular will not buy German products. They traveled to Israel a number of years ago and paid more so they would not have to stop in Germany. So I think we have that older population who still strongly remember, and it's strongly in their hearts. However, my daughter Jordan, who's 24, went on a school trip to Berlin, and it was excellent, and she loved being there. Not like, hey, I'm moving there, I'm going back, but I'd go back. I want to see more. Right. So, do you? What's your take on that?
I think your generational breakdown is pretty right on. I think there is this sense. Interestingly, Germany created a law of return that if you are a Jew with German ancestry, you can move to Germany and get established there, no questions asked. So if you're, because they are in a place where they're really wanting to rebuild a Jewish population there. So I think that's an interesting side note. I think there are some really interesting things within Israel. In Israel, if you go there, most of the taxis are Mercedes-Benz. Right. And you're like, why are all the taxis so good? These taxis are better than my car in America. And that goes back to German reparations, that it was like one of these things that making German engineering cars very cheap in Israel, which I think is an interesting thing as well. I do know a number of my survivors, when asked, some of them will say, yeah, I've been back to Germany, or I've been back to Poland, and they are fine with it. And other people were like, no, I would never go back. I would never, this is a dead place for me. It's like visiting a cemetery. So why would I do that? And one of my survivors who spoke for years and years and years, she's still living, but she can no longer speak publicly, a woman named Ray David.
She spoke to my class a number of years ago. Yeah.
She's amazing. And she would ask, and her whole message is around love and, not hating people. But when she would say, people would often ask, do you forgive the Germans? And she goes, they've never asked for my forgiveness. And for her, this was like, how can I forgive someone if I've never been, and how could people ask for my forgiveness for this? Right. So I think it's this complicated question that really varies on each individual.
Okay, which is a really good segue to the final question that I have for you today. I know that sadly, many of our survivors have passed away. They're elderly. They may have been adults during this time period. But do you have any data on how many survivors of the Holocaust came to live in Milwaukee?
We think in Wisconsin it's about 2,000. And probably about, the majority of those are in Milwaukee, and it's really hard to say. Some people joined communities, and there's also within survivor communities, there are some complicated, I keep saying everything, you're like, there's got to be a simple question. There is no simple question. Even that within the survivor community, there's sometimes a little bit of a debate, less so now than there was, say, 40 years ago. Are you a survivor if you left Germany in 1938? You were traumatized, your family lost things, but you weren't in a concentration camp.
Right.
And so we would say now, yes, you're a survivor, but within the survivor communities, there was a little bit of a challenge in identifying what that meant to be a survivor. And there actually, within the Jewish community of Milwaukee, there were two separate clubs that kind of formed around that, the New American Club and the New Home Club, one which was for survivors who came from Germany and Austria before the war started, and the other that came from Poland and Lithuania and Russia and places like Hungary after the war was over.
Got it.
So those two communities exist. I think one of the things that you find with those communities is that the majority of people who survived the Holocaust is they weren't really adults. They were teenagers. Most of the people who survived the Holocaust were like Ellie Wiesel, between the ages of like 15 and 22. And so they were really rebuilding lives for themselves, trying to build families and have kids as quickly as possible because they lost so much. And that's one of those kinds of stories. And I always think it's so important when you're studying the Holocaust to understand that there wasn't this immediate like, hey, you've survived the Holocaust, we want you in our place. You should come to us. That it took a long time for people to figure out where they could go, how they could get into places. And there were still quotas and visa obligations and things that had to be filled. None of that was waived. Some things were added in the immediate post-war time. But it's one of the many reasons why Israel becomes a country, because there wasn't someone who just stood up and said, oh, there are 1 million people who survived the Holocaust. Let's figure out what we can do with them.
Absolutely. So Ellie, last question, not related to the Holocaust. Any idea when the museum's opening again?
No, but kind of. Maybe by the end of July, we hope. We're going to probably have small timed ticketed operations. We're working on what it looks like to be a clean museum, and how to keep people socially distant, how to do things without paying, without prepaying and cashless as much as possible. It is a huge challenge in all industries. Sure. And I'm sure you guys as a school are starting to think about, what does school look like next year? Is there school next year? That's what we're doing right now too.
Okay, so little plug for you and a note to my students. You guys, if anybody has any interest over the summer when the museum opens in going, shoot me an email. I'll meet you. I'll even pay for you to go. So it would be really cool. So
yeah. And our hope is that we're working on it to get an extension for Girl in the Diary. So our hope is that it was supposed to close this weekend.
Oh, wow.
Clearly it wasn't, but our hope is that through the end of the summer, based on what that timing is, that we'll be able to have that still on display.
And that was such an excellent display. I really was happy to have the opportunity to see it. So, all right. Ellie, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Students, miss you guys.
I look forward to meeting you in the future.